Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Good morning and welcome to this morning's meeting of the Housing Committee. The public may like to follow us on @London Assembly on social media and use #LondonHousing for this meeting. Please, I remind you to put your devices on silent and please move them away from the microphone. And if you're hotspotting, please turn them off because that really does disrupt the microphones. The main item of business this morning is the financial sustainability of the housing sector. We'll be focusing primarily in London. Can I ask my clerk, Diane Richards, if we have had any apologies?
Thank you, Chairman. No apologies have been received today.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out in item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare? Can we note the outstanding actions from previous meetings? Noted. Right. That brings us to our main business, which is the sustainability of the housing sector. Can I please welcome our guests, Michaela Bygrave, Visibility Consultant for the Community-Led Housing and Managing Director of Pointe, Michel. Seena Shah, Director of Communications, Federation of Master Builders. Dr. Chris Foye, Lecturer in Housing Economics, University of Reading, and joining us virtually, do we have both? Yes. Okay. Katy Warrick, Head of London Residential Research, Savills, and Amy Shaw, Partner, Trowers and Hamlins, LLP. Thank you all for attending. I'm sure we're going to have a great meeting. So we're going to move on to our first questions. And as is our tradition as a chairman, I will take the first couple of questions. I'll start with Katy and Amy, please. Maybe Katy first. What kinds of firms are responsible for building the most homes in London?
Hi there. So yeah, I've been looking into this, and clearly, you know, the big listed house builders have been really important over the last few years. You know, Berkeley Homes, Barratt Homes, Taylor Wimpey, and so on. However, they have started to slow down their activity, certainly their land buying activity in London. And when I've been looking at the proportions of who's been delivering it in terms of specifically in the SME area, we have seen that the structure of the market has changed significantly since 2020. So whether that's a pandemic impact, but then, you know, corroborated and reinforced by this year's events as well around build costs, which have been really significant, coupled with, of course, the wider housing market slowdown. So all of these factors are leading to lower levels of activity across the board. So starts on site are down significantly. I've paid particular focus to the private starts on site figures using Molly data, which doesn't capture the whole market, but it does capture the majority of the market. We estimate about 90%. And starts on site are down about, sorry, let me get my figures. Starts on site are 60% down below their peak in 2015, which is quite significant. But the majority of that has been in the last year. And it's not just construction activity that's been affected. It's at every stage. So it starts on sites, it's planning applications, it's planning permissions, so as well as land activity. So it's at every single stage, which leads us to suggest that you know, the worst is yet to come.
Would those figures suggest that that's a trend, that the trend is still downwards? Because you said that most of that slowdown has been this year. Is that a downward trend, or are we at the bottom already?
I would suggest that it's a downward trend, because the forward-looking indicators for housing delivery, the planning activity, the land buying activity is still very, very weak. So there's a lot of how can I say it? There's a lot of planning busyness. There's a lot of activity, but it's not necessarily new sites coming through. There's a lot of activity because there's a lot of, you know, amendments to planning applications to reconfigure stair cores and those sorts of issues, which have again been a significant feature of especially the London market.
Is there a lot of activity to reconfigure things just from an economic point of view, to try and maybe go higher, to make things more viable, or, you know, is that a feature that we're seeing?
That doesn't feel to me to be the main reason. The main reason is to reconfigure, to try and fit in an extra stair core to fit the fire safety guidance. There's hesitation to go higher because build costs are a major concern, and obviously towers are more expensive to build. But the viability, you know, thinking about, well, how do developers make it work when they have these constraints? If they can't go any wider on the plot size, which is, you know, unlikely, they're going to be losing net to gross. They're going to be losing value from that. So in some instances, they are going back into planning and renegotiating around the affordable housing delivery, or they are going higher in some cases. But there's a whole mix of solutions. And there's some cases where it's no longer viable for residential and it's ending up being delivered as a commercial scheme instead. Okay, thank you. Amy, is there anything that you'd like to add?
I would completely reiterate what Katy said. I think the majority of the delivery is the big developers. I appreciate we're not particularly focusing on it today, but the RPs and the local authorities are delivering in their own right an element. But I think one of the key issues would be around the fact the element to which the RP sector supports the big developers, and actually the struggles which the RP sector are facing is having a knock-on effect on those developers and all the issues that Katy referred to. And I completely reiterate what's been said. I don't think we're at the bottom yet. So talking to the clients we work with, talking to people, you know, actually the pipeline or the immediate next year or so isn't too bad. But then it drops off a cliff. And actually now what people are looking at is what's going to happen in 3 to 5 years, because with the planning process and things, actually, now is the time people need to start looking at that because of the long-term reading. The other thing I would just say, completely reiterate again what Katy said on the second stair clause. I don't think people are going back into increased fight and things just because of viability in itself. It's all around the second stair clause. What we are seeing get away a lot still is what I would call low-rise family housing, and that tends to be outside of London, obviously because of the constraints of the sector, land in London. For that low-rise housing, we're seeing huge investor interest, and I think one of the things we could perhaps discuss further is how we can get investors more interested to take on some of the opportunities within London and those more complex sites.
When you say to get investors to take on more complex sites, do you mean the low-rise complex sites or high-rise as well?
High-rise as well. So obviously the challenge within London is, as Katy said, we've got land supply issues. There's not as much ground footprint, so we tend to have to go higher. There is, across the development sector, a real lack of appetite for building high-rise at the moment because of second stair clause, because of the increased build cost. So where we're seeing development get away is definitely still perhaps more out of London or sort of out of outer suburbs is low-rise housing. And that's getting huge interest from the investor sector to come in and either purchase that or fund that. But we're not seeing that appetite for the more complex inner city development. So I think there's an angle there that is worth looking at how we can get that away.
Okay, thank you for that. I'd like to bring Dr. Chris in as well on this next question. How does the house building sector in London differ from the rest of the UK?
Thanks. So my kind of area of expertise around this would be specifically the 3 biggest house builders, which would be Taylor Wimpey, Barratt and Persimmon. So if you look at them, particularly since really the global financial crisis, they pivoted away from the London market. Persimmon's not really there at all. Taylor Wimpey and Barratt are, albeit I would say to a lesser extent. So you got a slightly different kind of ecosystem of house builders. You've also got big build to rent developers here, which and in other cities, which wouldn't be quite so present in other parts of the country. And generally, if we look at kind of, there's obviously data limitations, so I'm kind of speculating a little bit here or making inferences. But if we look at big global cities, they tend to attract much more institutional investment from internationally, because global markets are like London, like New York, and like Berlin. They're much more liquid. Once you buy a property in London, you can much more easily sell it, and also they tend to be much more diversified. So they don't move up and down with the national economy quite so much as property prices in the rest of the country. So so I think it's really important to recognise that when a developer is developing, they're thinking about who's going to buy it, and therefore you have to look to understand developing. You need to understand the kind of actual drivers of prices and the demand factors as well. So to come back to your question, I mean, I don't really have the Mollyar's data or anything to really kind of dig deep data to actually understand exactly how it differs, but it's mainly in terms of, I know that I'd expect it to be greater international development here, and I know for sure that the likes of Persimmon have less presence in London than they do in the rest of the country.
Katy, I'll come back to you shortly, Katy, just to give you a heads up. Just to drill a little bit deeper, you say the big house developers, which hopefully will move out of our conversation by the end of these questions, but why are the likes of Persimmon left London? Why have they moved on? I think that's important for us to know.
Yeah, again, you would need to ask them directly, but I think to get a better sense. But I mean, what we did is we've looked through all the earnings calls transcripts and the kind of data of these three house builders since 2008 with my colleague Ed Shepherd, and the kind of inference we would make is that it's really before global financial crisis there was a heavy emphasis on brownfield sites from the government in terms of they wanted to shift development towards brownfield sites. So that there was a planning element for sure. There's also with developments in London, there's also when you're doing development, there's a really what you're looking for is optionality is crucial, right? If you're developing, if you look at someone like Berkeley, then they're developing over years and years and years. I couldn't say how much, but you know, they're from buying a site to actually completing and selling a site, you're looking at 10 years, right? Probably, I would kind of speculate. So there's over that time, there's a huge amount that can happen. So what you're looking at as a developer is what options can I build in so that I can change use or I can stop it or kind of build out more slowly. And those optionalities, if you're building a high-rise development in London, are significantly less than if you're building out a greenfield site on the edge of Birmingham, right? Because if you're building out a greenfield site on the edge of Birmingham, you can, if demand starts to slow down, you can kind of pause the development. You can maybe complete part of it and kind of hold the land for the rest of it. Whereas if you're building a kind of high-rise development in London, then you've got to, once you've started building, you can't sell half a high-rise building, right? You have to keep on going, which makes it kind of risky. And why a lot of developers, I think particularly in London, try and pre-sell their properties because it mitigates that risk.
Okay, thank you. Katy, let me just remind you of the question. How does house building sector in London differ from the rest of the UK?
Yeah, it was really to give a little bit more colour around the Molior statistics, because we analyse this in depth, and it really does give a good understanding of the profile of the sales market. What I don't have is to be able to compare that to what happens outside of London, but I think you've just heard a very good explanation of how the house builder model works, especially when you're thinking about houses versus flats. But predominantly, development in London is 95% flats, so just 5% on houses, and of the sales market at the moment, that has seen a big drop off in the volume of sales compared to Q3 of last year. So if we think just in those 12 months, in the last 12 months, we're down on private sales exchanges. So some of those are off plan as well, which they always have been for the new build market. They're down about 35%. That about 40% of that, 40% when you look at just the mainstream market. So the prime, we can ignore prime. This is a mainstream London issue, and it very much coincides with the end of Help to Buy. That has been the major. It's the domestic market that has left the new build sector. That is the main challenge that we've seen, and obviously the end of Help to Buy has been, you know, the timing wise has absolutely lined up with a wider slowdown, higher interest rates. The average Londoner, whether you're buying a new build or a second hand, is going to be really struggling to get a mortgage, to be able to to firstly save a deposit that's required, which again, long-standing issue for London, but now to be able to sustain those mortgage payments if they can get a mortgage on those higher interest rates is really, really difficult. So the end of Help to Buy frankly couldn't have come at a worse time. It wasn't that we didn't have foresight that this was going to happen. This was obviously, lots of notice, but with the wider market conditions, it has been really detrimental. So we've seen a massive drop off in new build sales. We've talked about some of the other elements of what those sales are. So Molior classification of a sale also includes build to rent. We've seen that we did see a bit of an interruption to the build to rent sales as such in Q2, but it has broadly picked up. Investment levels in build to rent across the country have been down, and we expect that it will come back. It will come back. Whilst those yields are looking better elsewhere, those investors are going to be looking at gilts and other investment classes, but we expect that there is still that appetite to come back to London. So but the one gap that we have for the new build London market is the domestic buyers. It's such a small amount. We see 20% of sales are going to overseas, 25% to 30% are going to build to rent. There's a few that are switching to affordable, a few bulk deals. Again, probably you count that as sort of investor activity. The domestic market is really, really minimal, and that I see as the major challenge.
Okay, thank you. Just bring in Assembly Member Cooper.
Thanks very much, and really interesting answers there. I just wondered if either Chris or Katy knows of any examples outside of London of something similar to Redrow, who 2 or 3 years ago suddenly declared that they were actually going to exit the London market completely, and they're a sort of fairly large, I mean, not as large as Persimmon obviously, but a fairly large player, and for all the schemes where they didn't already have spades in the ground, they sort of pulled the plug on them all, and as far as I know haven't come back to London. Are there any other builders that have done that in London, or are any examples of something similar going on outside of London that you know of? Start with Chris.
In short, nothing kind of particularly like that, as extreme as that. But as I said, there was a general pivot away from the London market by all the big three since really the global financial crisis. I think it's the land market's also a big thing. In the outside of London, the land market's been, for the big house builders, land market has been extremely good since 2012, 13, basically since Help to Buy. Help to Buy inflated the new build premium. Well, let me restate that. In all likelihood, it inflated the new build premium, which is the difference between prices that new builds get in the market and the existing stock. And land values didn't go up with that. For the large scale greenfield sites that the big volume house builders develop outside of London. In London, the land market was much more responsive to that inflation in new build premium, or to the increase much more, and therefore margins outside of London, profit margins outside of London, were, at least for the house builders we looked at, were much more generous than. Well, we can't say for sure, because we don't actually have the profit margins for the ones who are working in London. But it would seem, we wouldn't fair that they were likely to have been significantly high. Profit margins were likely to be significantly higher outside London than inside London, particularly relating to those big house builders, because the land market was more generous.
I do think that is pretty much why Redrow took that decision. Katy, I don't know whether you can add anything to what Chris has just said.
Yeah, I can't think of any that have been as dramatic, certainly publicly, in terms of their strategy and actions. But you notice it happening even with Berkeley Homes. They have a lot of sort of outer London large regen schemes. We talked about like the process from buying the land all the way through to delivery. Some of those cash flows are 30 years or 35 years from buying the land or doing the deal with the St William structure, all the way through to the final sort of sales of those schemes. It's an enormously long time, so they are going to see a pivot on their strategy at certain points throughout that period. They have the ability, they have a lot of sites, I think it's around 90 across London currently, to be able to slow down, speed up. Many of them are multi-phase large schemes, so again they have the ability to think about different options. However, even the likes of Berkeley, they're very well, they've got lots of cash, they've done very well, they're in a good position, but a very strong sort of balance sheet. Even those people are looking outside of London because they notice the difficulties of delivering in London. So you're seeing that it's not necessarily that they're exiting London, but they're definitely expanding outside of London. So a recent large permission down in Guildford, big activity in Milton Keynes, Birmingham, this wasn't happening 10 years ago. This is the latest, the 5-year trend. So there are definitely the big players looking outside of London. Barratt again, they have had a really strong holding in London, perhaps less so in the last few years. So it's really interesting. It's definitely happening. I would say I know we're probably going to move on to SMEs, but having chatted to our land team, one of the observations that they make is that it's the SMEs who absolutely find it they're not able to operate in London anymore. The ones that they saw 5 to 10 years ago just find it too hostile a planning environment to be able to get schemes off the ground. And everything for a developer is about risk and reward, and the reward isn't there. And obviously the market has been very weak actually in London. I mean, particularly the last year, but actually the last 5 years has been pretty nothing too exciting happening to be able to give them that sort of reward.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Do you want to come in, Assembly Member Barry?
Yeah, can I just clarify something that came up a few minutes ago? I think Chris was talking about the build-to-rent sector in London, and then Katy, you were talking about the people who were buying the homes, and you talked about build-to-rent that. Did you mean buy-to-rent? Sorry, just to get clarification.
It's actually a good point. It's a clarification of it's part of the classification of a sale. So Molior sales analysis, which is genuinely the best. We have our own Savills experience, but Molior covers the whole market. We have that visibility on who is buying, but what they count as a sale, a new build sale, is basically anything that has started on site as a new build home. So if it goes to build to rent, that still counts as a sale in their eyes. So that in the data when we're reporting sales, it is really talking about all of the exit routes available to to that developer.
Okay, so you did mean the build to rent sector, the sort of more institutional type people who are effectively selling to themselves there.
Yeah,
because they're not selling it to buy to rent.
No, the buy-to-let investor, UK, I mean, and overseas to some extent, has largely disappeared. So the finances and the regulation, again, affecting that particular group of buyers. Again, it's risk and reward, and the reward hasn't been there to warrant the risk. And now that the cost interest rate has gone up, so anyone who is a mortgaged buy-to-let investor is not going to find it stacking up favourably at the moment for any new or indeed some existing investments. So we're actually seeing landlords selling up from the sector, and that is one of the factors that is exacerbating the rent rises that we're seeing, the really strong rental growth that we're seeing at the moment.
Okay, so that's domestic landlords having difficulties. In the data we have in the Housing in London report, it does look like the overseas buyers are sort of bouncing back and becoming a greater proportion of the market, but also higher in real terms as well. Are they landlords or people wanting second homes?
There's the majority of overseas buyers are landlords, but it's increasingly becoming more of an owner-occupier market. A lot of what we classify as an overseas sale is actually done to foreign nationals who are already here or already have sort of operations here. So whether they are already living here and the sales are done via, if their first language is, say, Chinese or something, we might classify it as an overseas sale because of the team that are doing the deal. But actually, we call it our UK China desk, accounts for an increasing share of those overseas sales. And also with the BNO, we've seen a lot of Hong Kong buyers come over to relocating in London as well.
Okay, thank you. That's clear. Thank you. Sorry, Chair.
Thank you. Can we move on to Assembly Member Moema?
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everybody. My question is to Katy and Amy, but obviously if anybody else has any comments, then please do come in. So how are firms delivering the most homes in London responding to the current market conditions, and what does that mean for housing supply? So perhaps we'll start with Katy.
Sorry, so how are firms responding to the housing market?
So how are firms who are the firms that are delivering the most homes in London, how are they responding to current market conditions?
Yep.
And what does that mean for supply in London?
Yeah, so there's a number of things there. There's the fact that we know there's a reprioritization of delivery. So let's take Berkeley Homes. They've got a number of sites, probably the most across London, and some of those are enormous sites. So you're talking each one of those 90 sites could be thousands of homes, big multi-phase delivery. We know that there's a reprioritization going on with the, to slow down on some sites, to speed up the ones that they think that, so they can match firstly where the market demand is greatest, but also in terms of planning, to be able to speed up the ones that look like they will be able to get through planning the quickest, to be able to, potentially capitalise on a low delivery point in the market and be able to get their scheme through planning to be able to deliver at a time before anyone else can. So yeah, there's a bit of a bottleneck, I would say, and the main issue is around the second stair cause. One of the other things that we've seen around reacting to the market conditions, as I mentioned, the house prices are falling, transactions are low across the board, so not just new build. Mortgage approvals are down 35% nationally compared to last year. So it's a wider issue than just London, but of course London is feeling it the most when it hits the house builder, the delivery market for new homes, because the second stair cause, because the end of Help to Buy, the fact that London Help to Buy was so much more generous than outside of London. So you're seeing a real discrepancy between how affected London will be is compared to the rest. Of course, that is to address the more severe affordability challenge in London, but we are also seeing I feel like I'm using Berkeley Homes as every example here, but they even on some of their larger schemes, they are looking at taking a block out for either build to rent or senior living. So you're seeing them entertain sort of more options. They wouldn't typically have done that as part of their initial strategy. They're a big, well-oiled machine that has a strong sales record. They haven't needed to do this in the past. So the last year has been exceptional. They've realised that they've got, in areas where they've got maybe more stock, or maybe there's more competition in that local area, they've looked at doing a build to rent deal.
Amy?
Thank you. Yes, so to reiterate again, we are seeing much more interest in bringing forward some early blocks for build to rent or investor sales. Trying to get those where there's planning issues related to that, because obviously within Section 106 agreements, there's often provisions around bringing forward affordable housing, which is completely understood and the need for that, but often that discourages investors taking an early block on a build to rent basis, because they're worried about whether they're going to be able to occupy those when the affordable's coming forward. So that there is an issue that we're coming across on that. What I'm seeing from the house builders that we work with is not an absolute reluctance, but a definite reluctance to take on significant private sale risk in their own right. So we're seeing still a lot of interest in the partnerships, so between house builders and registered providers, housing associations, because it's obviously a way of sharing risk, half the risk, half the cost, that kind of model. And being honest, I believe that the house builder sector also sees, that there's flexibility in terms of exit options there, because if the market doesn't allow the private sales, there's potentially the ability to deliver more affordable. So it just allows more flexibility. So the partnership activity is still quite strong, and I think a number of house builders are looking at that as a way to keep delivering in London in the current circumstances. We're also seeing, I think Katy alluded to this, looking at how they can speed up and slow down, looking at phasing. So perhaps if the scheme is several blocks, can we deliver one block as a phase and bring that forward? Again, there's planning challenges around that. And then the other thing is, and perhaps this is where for Assembly and the Mayor, but is around whether extra grant can be leveraged in through working with local authorities, working with the registered provider sector to help viability, whether that's in terms of the actual pure affordable housing delivery, or whether that's in terms of unlocking infrastructure or things like that.
Okay, and in your opinion, then, how much more grant would be needed to, if you like, prop up the market? Because the value of that's gone down as well with inflation, like everything else.
So I don't know whether Katy has actual numbers, and I'll let her come in a moment, perhaps. From my perspective, there is no magic number, because every site has different challenges. Every site requires different levels of subsidy, potentially. I think obviously more grant and subsidy would be brilliant, but we all have to accept we're in an economic climate where there isn't an endless pot of gold. So I think perhaps we need to be more innovative in how we can look at subsidy, whether actually there's opportunities rather than it being pure subsidy, whether it can be put in as equity to help get things off the ground, whether there's options around guarantees or things like that. So being a bit more creative in terms of the level of subsidy available rather than just perhaps what we've traditionally considered as grants.
Thank you. So my next one is to Seena and Michaela. So what, in your opinion, is the difference between small and medium-sized house builders, and how resilient are they to market conditions? So let's start with Michaela. Oh, Mike.
Thank you, I was on mute. Okay, so I'll just say a bit about my background. So I work with small builders, I would say more than the medium-sized ones. So these would be builders looking at sites between about 2 to 10 units. So you can imagine quite small. It would tend to be infill sites or, those kind of sites. I think the difference, one of the differences between the large builders and the small builders is that, so especially, the builders I work with, which tends to be more, sorry, do I need to get closer? Community-led housing builders is they're not as speculative. So as sort of Katy and Dr. Chris have mentioned, that large house builders are building in the hope that someone will buy it at the end. They don't have the buyers lined up, and that's why they would want to change the phasing and things like that. The small house builders, and this is probably different to medium, which I'll let Seena answer, but the small house builders that I tend to work with, they've already sold the units at, before they buy them. So in that sense, it does tend to de-risk it. I think, I'm not sure what else I would sort of pick. I mean, yes, it does de-risk it, but in a sense, they are also in a lot of cases working on trickier sites that I would say are more costly to develop. So you've got that risk factor as well. They don't have the same vertical integration with the trades that the larger house builders would have. So obviously the cost of building for them is often higher. So yeah, there are sort of quite a few differences, I would say, between small, medium and the larger house builders.
And just really quickly, before I move on to you, so Amy's point about grant and access to it, how does that land kind of with the smaller house builders? Is that something that you struggled with?
So I would echo Amy's point that every site is different, and one of the things I think needs to be looked at rather than grant is getting sites more ready for development. So the cost can be quite high for a lot of developers to just, do the groundwork to get to the point where they're able to develop. You can still get planning on a site, but technically it would be extremely difficult to actually develop it. So I think that when sites are, for example, looking at the GLA small sites, which some of my clients have, they've purchased those, they let's say a typical site is a garage site. So you'd have a site with a garage, but for example, one of them that I remember looking at was right by TfL rail line on the other side. So actually the cost of, like you couldn't bring a crane in TfL, or like absolutely no way are you allowed to bring a crane in to develop this site. So then the cost of having to find other ways, it was a very narrow site. So you may think, well, modular or something where you wouldn't need to do the build on site, but because the entrance was so narrow, and these modular trucks are, huge to try and get the bits in. So it created so much extra cost and so much more, you need a very good project manager who would typically or preferably dealt with something like this before to develop that site. And obviously specialists tend to be more expensive than generalists. So again, you're paying for a more expensive person to do the job. So what I suppose would have looked like a good opportunity became extremely difficult to actually develop. So I think in terms of grant, I would say actually I think more needs to be done in, as Amy said, maybe it's not about putting money in per affordable unit or something like that, but it's about getting sites more ready. It's about maybe equity shares. So one of the things I think is not necessarily selling the sites, but being long leasehold. And if that means then, at the end of 30, 50 years, the site either goes back to the GLA or there's a equity sharer at that point, then where the units are worth a lot more, it can be remortgaged and the GLA can get their share out, or whoever the landowner is, whether that's any local council. So I think that the environment that we're in, we maybe can't just get our way out of it by grant. I think that we maybe need to be a bit more creative about what the solutions need to look like, because as Dr. Chris said, London is a completely different market than outside London. It doesn't work on the same economics that the rest of the UK works on. So it needs novel solutions that, you know, people aren't having to use outside of London.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Seena?
So we recently launched our house builder survey, and I've just brought out the members that answered that survey that were London based, and we did see a difference in terms of the responses that they gave us over the rest of the country, and certainly planning wasn't as high up on their list of constraints as other builders across the rest of the country. What really dominated the London scene was financial constraints and shortage of skilled workers. I absolutely echo everything that's been said before. We need to find more unique ways and creative ways to financially support SME builders to be able to viably build in London if we want more SME builders. The reality is that there are many SME builders that do not build homes. They do renovation works, they do extensions, but they do not build houses. So there is definitely a need to support more SME builders to enter the house building market, to actually be able to deliver some sort of impact on house building. Just in terms of figures of, you know, these are about 50%, about half of the house builders in London, SME house builders in London, are turning over at less than £500,000 a year. And about 80% of those are turning over under 5 million a year. So these are very cash flow reliant businesses. Finance is absolutely critical. And as soon as costs go up, that has such a big impact on their ability to deliver house building. And just to mention that only 32% of those are totally focused on house building. So the majority of SME builders in London that build houses also offer other building services, and house building just makes up a small proportion of that. They tend to build something between 1 to 5 homes a year, and very few build more than 10 homes a year. And when you look at the targets that London has around house building on small sites that you need SMEs to deliver, it means you need something like over 10,000 small businesses every year to be able to deliver on that target. We don't have that many SME builders in the London market at the moment, so there's certainly a lot that needs to be done to help more of the SME builders that are delivering other services to enter the house building market.
Okay, and how would that happen? How would you get those that are not building homes to build homes, because they might be perfectly happy doing what they're doing, or, you know, working on interiors, which is a lot warmer, and not wanting to be actually building?
Yes, there's. I think it's about kind of debunking some of the difficulty myths that exist in how do I enter that market. There's a lot more to consider when you're starting to build a house from scratch, I think, than just an extension that you've been doing for 10 years quite successfully. So perhaps some sort of mentorship scheme that helps those that have already entered the market to pass their learning and experience on to those that would like to enter the market. A financial incentive of some kind to help them with their first build, because I think once they've built once, they're more likely to build again. So anything that helps them to build their first home, I think, would be really, really helpful. But effectively, it's about that upfront cost, and if they can't access lending, or lending is too expensive that it makes it unviable, that's the biggest challenge, as we've seen, even with those that are already building. And certainly looking forward, we are seeing an exit of people that currently build houses from the market, and those that are going to remain expect to build more. So what you're getting at the moment is a narrower pool, and what we need is a bigger pool of SME builders.
Thank you, Assembly Member. We're going to move on to Assembly Member Berry.
Thank you. It's on the same kind of thing, but I've got a few questions now about the wider sort of market conditions and how they affect smaller builders in particular. So I want to start with you, Seena. Back to you again, I'm afraid. At the moment, the Mayor's housing strategy says SME builders are more likely to keep building homes in downturns than larger volume developers. Does this reflect what you think?
Yeah, I mean, if you've got a business that is wholly reliant on house building to turn over an income, they are going to continue to build houses regardless of the market conditions out there. And I mean, the sad reality is that we recently saw the ONS figures come out that of businesses that are becoming insolvent, and 40% of those were construction companies. So there obviously is a challenge. There's certainly more businesses exiting the market because of finances, but the reality is large housing developers, it's a numbers game. We've heard already that they release houses as and when it suits them to do so. SME builders don't do that. SME builders don't build by numbers. They absolutely build properties that they're proud of and that they know people want to live in. And I think the reality is that it does cost a bit more money. And as we've heard before, they rely on generalists rather than specialists. They can't always afford the specialists. So when they do need to bring those in, it costs more money. So yeah, I mean, I think absolutely that the external factors around house building, probably SMEs are more resilient to those in some ways, but in terms of cash flow, it certainly does affect them.
And so you're saying that they would never hold back on selling a house that they've built because of lower prices. They would just get it out there because they need to get working on the next project.
Absolutely, it's the cash flow. It's that, they need to get that property sold so they can move on and build the next one.
Okay, that's really useful. Thank you. And to Michaela, about the community-led sector, how does that get affected by market conditions? I think you said before that buyers are already lined up, but they could slip away. What are things going on?
Yeah, I think the Mayor's point about a downturn probably is referring to the previous sort of financial crises that we've had, say, in the last sort of 20 years. I don't want to say this because everyone says it, but I do think this time is different. Like we've had like a massive, loads of events have happened at the same time, which each on their own would have been, quite difficult for the market. So we had the pandemic. And we had Brexit, and what that did is that during the pandemic, a lot of construction workers went back to Europe, and then because of Brexit, they didn't come back. And they maybe weren't expecting to not come back, but they actually decided that it was fine when they went home, and they weren't going to come back. So what happened with that is during the pandemic, there was a massive rise in materials globally. That wasn't anything to do with Brexit. That was what was happening in China and stuff like that. So construction materials went up massively, but then what happened here was labour costs went up massively with that. So it became very difficult for a lot of groups to get viable projects, despite perhaps even having land that was cheaper than the market rates. So that did become quite difficult, but we carried on. What then happened was the interest rate rise. So then that meant that projects that I was looking at where we had priced it at a certain amount. So I think I should do a bit of background explaining about it's not necessary that community-led housing is affordable, but for the GLA, they would prefer, so when you're developing in London, that you would have an element of affordable housing, which I think is fair because you are using public land and public subsidies. So the way that affordable housing is valued is different to the way market housing is valued, in that it's done on a rental basis, so as you would do with investment property, but the rent that you're using is obviously a lot less. So the value that's against that is very low. So what we were finding is that we couldn't borrow loads to start with anyway, and then with the interest rate rise, so I'm just trying to think what we sort of saw in terms of rise for mortgages, but it was something like, so at the moment you're looking at 6.5% to 7%, and that's for mortgage, that's not for development finance. So development finance is higher than that. This is for actual, 30-year mortgage. So that decreases what groups are able to borrow, and then that decreases what they're able to offer. So there is a real problem at the moment in terms of viability for sites and making sites viable. And again, I don't think there's a silver bullet solution, because I think a lot of things happened all at the same time. If it were just interest rates, there would be if it would just increase in materials or build cost, it would have been perhaps another solution. So yeah, it's a difficult time, I would say, for community-led housing. When the materials cost went up, the idea was, well, we'll still carry on because the prices will come down eventually. Even with interest rates, I know some of the lenders that I've been speaking to have said, well, in 2 years we expect, 2024, we're expecting it to come back down again. So let's carry on. So although schemes are not affordable now, let's assume by the time they're delivered in 2 years they will be. It's a bit of a gamble. So we hope, obviously you hope that it goes that way, because otherwise schemes that, once we go to get on site, we may find that we've got to think very carefully about how they're actually funded, because the mortgage doesn't cover the sales costs for forward funded schemes. So yeah, so it's difficult. I did say to Ashley I'd try to be positive, but it is a difficult environment out there at the moment.
Chris, you've indicated you want to come in.
Yeah, just to kind of emphasise what kind of Seena and Michaela are saying is, you need to think about kind of interest rates operating through two channels. So interest rates kind of depress demand for new build housing, because they reduce kind of the ability to borrow. But then they also increase the cost of debt. If you've got debt on your balance sheet, so it operates through those two channels. Now, if you're a larger house builder, a lot of the big three anyway have very little debt, so it only goes through that. It only goes through that first channel. But if you're a smaller house builder, you've got much more debt, so you're getting both channels essentially that you're getting hit by. So I think it's interest rates are so crucial to the kind of the current story that but it's pretty much what you both were saying anyway.
Sorry, Assembly Member Barry. So just to go back to Sheena then, so really the resilience, I just want to labour this point, the resilience that medium-sized house builders display is purely through need. They're as susceptible to all of these changes, but they have absolutely no choice, is really what we're saying here.
Yeah, when you look at the kinds of builds that SMEs, sort of larger SMEs build, it tends to be for private clients who want a home built, rather than for architects, developers, main contractors, that kind of thing. That only makes up something like 40% of the builds that they deal with. But 84% of those are self-builds. So the demand is already there as they're building. They know they're going to sell that, they know they're going to pass that property on, or it's being funded by somebody who's asking them to build this property for them. I suppose that there's very few SME builders that would go into the market not knowing that they've got buyers at the end of the journey, because they need to be able to sell that property quickly.
Okay, thank you, Assembly Member.
Thank you, Chair. So I just wanted to quickly ask, I think both of you, if you know anything about it, I'm not sure about the community-led relation to this, but going back to the Housing in London report that came out very recently, that summarises what was going on with small sites in the period from 2012-13 to 2016-17, and then from 2017-18 to 2021-22. It's a very mixed picture across different boroughs, which is interesting because the market conditions more broadly might be expected to be the same. So for some boroughs, the amount on small sites has gone up, and on some it's gone down. And the one where it's gone up the most is Croydon, and it's gone up a lot in Croydon, the amount being delivered on small sites. And it says in the notes that this happened after supportive planning guidance was introduced. So I was just going to ask, do you know anything about Croydon in particular, and to what extent can planning guidance have such a large effect on what's possible for small sites and small builders to do?
The reality is that small builders do not have large teams that are able to sit there and digest planning and regulation. So any support that you can give builders to navigate that and the changing scene, because it is always changing, there's not a longevity in terms of regulation, will always help people to stay in the game and enter the game. I think that's the reality of it. Obviously, larger developers have the resources to have teams because they're building at such large scale to be able to understand what is coming, what they can do in terms of changes in materials as well. So, for example, as we move towards net zero and there is a change in what materials you're allowed to be able to use on site, the large developers are able to bulk purchase these. They know they're going to be able to use them up. Our SME builders are going to struggle more and more moving forward with that as well.
Okay, that's really interesting. Our planning committee was looking at those kinds of issues and making some recommendations outside of this, so that would be interesting to see. Michaela, and then I'll bring in Amy online as well, who's had a hand up.
My point's a bit more tongue-in-cheek, but I was smiling as you were talking because my aunt recently moved from Croydon because of the amount of planning that was happening there, and it was, it's too much for her. But she made an interesting point. She said, it's because the council need more council taxpayers, because obviously Croydon are in financial difficulties at the moment. So, whether that was helping why they made the planning simpler, but that's sort of my little tongue-in-cheek point.
That might be a little bit more accurate than you imagine.
Excellent. And then I was bringing in Amy because she had a hand up online before I moved to the next question. I've still got one more question as well, Chair, I believe. Amy, would you like to come in?
I was just going to add on the SMEs and the planning point. I think the delay in getting planning is such a prohibitive factor for SMEs. So I hear what's been said about actually perhaps the majority of SMEs aren't sort of developing sites in their own right to bring to market. But for those who are, they don't have the cash and the time to tie up in a site to wait for a long period to get planning through. So that was one point. The other point, where there's affordable housing requirements that come through for the small sites, the feedback I'm getting from clients and sort of people in the sector is that there's a lack of appetite from the registered provider to take up affordable housing on small sites. So they're just not interested in taking 2, 3, 6 units on a site. So that's been making it difficult for the SMEs to deliver because they're having to provide the affordable housing, which we all understand how important that is. But actually, if there's not appetite for that in that way, whether we need to be more flexible about how that requirement's met.
Okay, thank you very much. And I've got a further question that goes to Katy, Amy, and then Michaela, if that's okay. Can you tell us a bit more about what kinds of schemes are most affected by viability challenges and what this means for the kinds of schemes we might see in London going forwards? I think, Katy, you're the best person to start with that.
Yeah, it's so overwhelmingly across, I was tapping up a few different departments across Savills to help me prepare for this. And so in speaking to the land team, the viability team and the planning team, the overwhelming consensus is that schemes below £800 a square foot are not currently viable for residential, and especially not towers. And that's quite worrying, because when we do our analysis of where the greatest need is for London, and I think is widely known, the greatest need is for clearly firstly affordable housing, but even just thinking about the private housing, it's below £700, £800 a square foot. It's below that point. So we're not needing, to fix London's housing crisis, we're not needing to build at £1,000 a square foot, but obviously people want to live in those areas. What we need to be doing is focusing further down the value bands, and that is where the greatest hits is going to be from viability. And it's even thinking about areas that are well connected, right by stations, because then you have this requirement for and land economics would tell you you need to go higher to maximise the potential of that site. You need to get that density, and towers at the moment are not viable because of the higher costs, the greater risks, the variability of build costs. Build costs have been increasing significantly over the last couple of years. They've started to plateau a bit now, but they're plateauing at this higher level. So it's still a factor, and there are still certain elements of certain materials that are really volatile, and it just gives developers a real lack of certainty. And again, coming back to that point about, well, how does this affect different types of people? Obviously, the bigger developers, the house builders, are going to be better able to source the materials, the workers. They've got the workforce. They're not relying on smaller contractors. And the one thing we haven't mentioned yet so far, miraculously, is the construction companies that are going bust. It's actually, sorry, you did mention the insolvencies of SMEs, but Henry Construction, that has accounted for around 50 stalled sites across London. The Molior stats from their latest report show that stalled sites, there's 65 as at Q3, as at the end of September. There were 65 stalled sites across London, and that compares to just 10 in the financial crisis, just after the financial crisis, so in 2009. So that is stark. I wonder whether there's something about the government's, appetite for stepping in and helping delivery at that point was obviously there was quite a lot of support. But yeah, there's a number of issues, and it's not people sort of choosing to stall. There's contractors going bust. There's people not able to continue from a viability perspective. It's a real issue.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that suggestion as for a solution as well, because we're hearing a lot of problems today. Amy, would you like to add anything to that?
Nothing in great detail. I think the ones that we're seeing most viability on issues, though, is things that were designed pre the requirement for second staircases, which now require second staircases, and the loss of units that are potentially coming from that, and whether, yes, you potentially could add greater height, but then the extra complexities of that. So I think that is the area around greatest viability, where something was modelled on one set of criteria and one expectation, and now, quite understandably and for very good reasons, but the requirements have changed. And then I think the other thing which is affecting viability at different levels is the extent to which people are future-proofing for environmental and sustainability. Obviously that adds costs, but whether there's whether there's impact on values sort of resulting from that.
Okay, thank you. And then Michaela or Seena, would either of you like to add anything in terms of, you've talked quite a lot about the economics of what you're doing, in terms of viability itself, anything to add?
I was just going to say on Katy's point around build cost, because obviously we have seen it go up quite a lot in the last 2 years, and there is evidence that some of these material costs have actually gone down now, but costs have plateaued. So, they always go up very quickly, but they're extremely sticky to sort of ever go back down again. And I think that, for perhaps good reason, I think, builders build in that risk, because we have seen a lot of contractors go bust. So either main contractors or, subcontractors, and that has sort of derailed schemes, and that's added on cost. So I think it's sort of almost they're building in risk by, keeping build costs as high as they are, because we do know that some costs for certain things have gone back down, not back down, but have gone down more than what we're seeing in build costs. Build costs are still very high at the moment.
Seena.
And just to add to that, I think lots of SMEs are really struggling to forward plan based on build costs. So they actually don't know what the cost of materials is going to be week to week because of the volatility there. So it is particularly difficult for them to be able to price a job and to understand the viability of a project. And I think that's probably what has helped to contribute towards insolvencies generally in the construction industry. I also just wanted to pick up that point about planning. No matter what house builder you talk to, the majority of them would tell you that it feels like planning is not designed to help them to get planning through the system. In fact, quite the opposite. And I think there needs to be a real change in approach from planning professionals in local authority to actually be much more proactive and positive and their role should really be focused on how do we get this through and help you to be able to build the property rather than the opposite.
Okay, so in terms of, sorry, can I just get clarification on that? So you're saying that the local authorities need to give sort of stronger advice about what is and isn't across the line, as opposed to, because they can't change the planning policies, can they? They can give you advice, though, that says, do this, don't do this, be very clear about what it is you should be putting forward.
Yeah, so I suppose where every time a new regulation is brought in, they're asking for a report on something, but it might not be appropriate for that particular site to have a report on that thing. So they need to go and get some expert to tell them, well, it's not appropriate for that site. I've got one example of somebody who was trying to get some planning permission for a property through recently. There were 39 queries on it, and they were able to sit down with that particular planning professional and over a Zoom call in 30 minutes address those points. Had it happened via email, that would have gone on for 2.5 months because of the toing and froing. On top of that, I think when the approach of the planning department is we need to get properties built and we want to help to get these properties built, let's see the reasons that are genuine for the concerns that should prevent this planning and address those in an expedient way. I think that's very different from what is currently happening. What you've got at the moment is them being beaten by the rule book, really, in a way that's not adequate for some of the sites that they're building on.
Okay, thank you, that's great. Back to you, Chair.
I have two, before we come to you, Mr. Michel, could we be...
Yeah,
brevity would be appreciated.
Just on the point, I appreciate we're straying into planning, but just on that, it's my understanding that about 95% of planning permissions are granted. So I don't know how big of a problem it's what you're suggesting. Sounds like everybody is really struggling with the planning process. But if 95% of permissions are granted, then as Assembly Member Berry has said, is it that there are specific issues that a small or medium builder would struggle with that a large one wouldn't? Because I'm not quite sure what a local authority is supposed to do if the government changes the planning framework and they don't have staff to meet every builder because of the cuts over the last few years. So,
I totally appreciate where you're coming from. So new regulation being brought in ad hoc and then being delayed, and these things are not helpful, both for planning and also for the builder. I suppose where the point I'm trying to make is that the approach that is sometimes seen, and I'm not saying it's in all planning departments, but in some planning departments is that it has to go to appeal to get approved. It's going to get approved anyway when it goes to appeal, so why was it not just passed in the first place?
I will ask you, so we are definitely straying into planning.
Yeah, so what?
I just would like to respond to that. So are you suggesting that we should have a more automated system where we remove people and homes are just built, so automatic grant of homes? I'm not quite understanding.
I mean, automation would always be a great way to take the subjectiveness out of it. I suppose in some departments, what you're seeing is there is a culture to put up all of the brick walls to prevent the planning getting through, unless all of the boxes are ticked to an extreme factor. And sometimes what you find is that planning permission is rejected until it goes to appeal, where it's then approved. So I suppose there is definitely a cultural issue in some planning departments that prevents planning permission from being put through because of an over understanding of the rule book rather than it being applied appropriately. And I'm not saying that that's a big problem in London, as I've said before. It's something that affects maybe a third of our members. It's not something that we're seeing that is affecting everybody. But certainly when you've got small builders that haven't got lots of resource to throw at planning permission and understanding the new regulation and being able to compile reports that aren't appropriate for the sites on which they're building, it is an issue.
Thank you. Assemblymember Cooper?
Thank you. Just before I make the point I wanted to make, I didn't think I needed to say this, but just for clarity, I am actually a member of the local planning applications committee in one of the boroughs that I represent, and as we seem to have strayed
So why don't we not speak about planning at all?
It
has been raised. I accept that, but we
as it's come up in discussion.
I accept that, but we can help steer the conversation slightly away from planning.
Yeah, I wasn't going to discuss it. I'm just I'm amending my non-declaration of earlier, if you don't mind, Chair.
Yes, I do.
So
okay, thank you.
If we could just record that, I think it's for transparency purposes and not for that I don't receive any pecuniary gain from it at all. But I'd just like that recorded, given that we have just strayed into the issue of planning consents and otherwise. The point that I just wanted to ask was, I think it was Amy or Katy who said 65 stalled sites, and I just wanted to check you did mean that across London. And I was talking to somebody from the construction sector last week who expressed it in terms of units that were stalled. Now, I know obviously what you're applying for, because we just talked about this, can change as it goes through the planning system. But they expressed it as 51,000 units that are stalled. Is that a figure you recognise, rather than talking about it in numbers of sites stalled? Could you comment on that? Thanks.
I don't know, but if you give me two minutes, I can look it up very quickly on Molly Hall. It's very easy to do so. But yeah, the 65 sites
is London.
Is London.
Yeah.
I think it would be a push to say it would be equating to that much, but I can have a quick look for you.
It did sound like quite a lot. I'd be really happy if you would do that. I'm sure the Chair, meanwhile, will want to move on to other things. Thank you, Chair.
I do want to move on. I am going to bring in Assemblymember Devenish, but I would really appreciate that, Katy, if you could try to dig that out, and we'll come back to it later. Assemblymember Devenish.
I'll be brief now, Chair, but I just wanted to say, I think it's been a very useful meeting, but I don't get the impression, despite all the doom and gloom from the guests, and I agree with the doom and gloom, by the way, I should say that I've spent much of my career working in the industry, there doesn't seem to be any sense of urgency that we need to actually change the course of the ship. So I guess my question really is, has the GLA, are the officers, is Mr Khan ultimately and Mr Copley changing any of the policies that they brought in 7-ish years ago now, or are we just basically going towards the rocks?
So do you feel that the GLA are changing the environment for small builders? Is there anything they have done or could do? You talked about a change in culture, for instance. Is there anything the GLA have done that you've seen that could make things easier for small and medium-sized builders?
So I'll just talk about sort of community-led housing, which I think has had a lot of support from the GLA in the last, I would say 5 years, but that's only because I've only been involved in it for 5 years, so it could go back longer than that, as far as I know. I don't want to be radical here because I know it's, cross-party and all of that, but... Please do. Right, allowed to, okay. I personally think, and this is my personal view, fundamentally we have a broken housing market and we're not fundamentally addressing that. We're just finding ways to keep it propped up. So as much as the help we've had, unless we address the fact that housing is unaffordable for the vast majority of Londoners, and I want to say that a lot of the groups I work with that are looking for affordable housing, because you may have an image in your mind of who they are, but I'll tell you, they're architects, they're nursery workers, they're professional people who are on decent salaries, who are working, in a lot of cases full time. They would not meet the threshold to have social housing. So they're earning too much for that. They would be in private rental housing and they're looking for a more permanent solution. So I think when you have a market that doesn't meet the basic needs of the vast majority, I think you're always going to have, people that, unless whether it's through disability, whether they're raising children, they're always going to have people that would need subsidised housing. These are people that typically outside of London would not need subsidised housing. So fundamentally, that's not working. And what we're trying to do is what we have done in the past is just keep propping that up rather than sit and address that and look at taking, you know, a lot of people. So, for example, when I actually mentioned I was talking here, somebody said, make sure you tell them that land shouldn't be in the market. And I'm like, okay. But, you know, essentially a lot of people will feel very strongly that land should not be subject to market forces because that is people's housing, especially land that is zoned for housing. So I think until we, and, you know, I maybe had a little bit of a chat with Ashley about in other countries. So I know this sounds really radical, but when you look at places like Vienna, most people there would be housed in what we might call, say, social housing, but it's housing, cooperative housing on land that has been given by the municipality for very little money, you know, so that essentially what we would call middle income people are able to have an affordable rent and still have a decent quality of life. They're not spending 60% of their earnings on their rent. So, and, you know, and because of that, they're able to have choices. You know, they're able to have children. They're able to, you know, and these are choices that we see young Londoners are not able to have. So yeah, sorry, I'm on my soapbox at the moment. But to going back to your policies, there are policies, but all those policies support our current housing system, which is in itself broken. And I think until we sort of go back and look at what we need to do fundamentally differently, we're going to end up in the same place.
So just to say, I can't speak for all of the members of the committee, but I think you'll find quite a lot of agreement with what you've just said. I do need to move on to Assembly Member Sheikh, but before I do that, I would ask you then, everybody involved, all of our guests, maybe towards the end of the meeting, think of that one big radical policy change you would like to see. Can I just very quick then?
All I'd say is the simple answer is, and I don't disagree with anything that's just been said, is cost on cost on cost on cost, i.e. everything is too unaffordable because every piece of land is unaffordable. But one thing I would suggest that we've not mentioned any of the specific GLA policies. Nobody on the panel's mentioned, for example, the 35% affordable housing requirements. And I was just speaking to a G15 chief executive last week whose view was the GLA officers themselves are very good, but the leadership from the top means that the GLA is a nightmare, period. I'll leave it there, Chair.
Good soundbite, Tony.
Well, we're all guilty of that. Assembly Member Sheikh.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I mean, to clarify, it's not a 35% requirement. It's an opportunity to fast-track planning applications if they meet the 35% threshold for affordable housing, which has increased the affordable number of homes delivered in London, which is essential for the housing crisis. So
I'm going to, Assembly Member Sheikh, thank you for that clarification. I'm going to allow that one clarification. Can we just focus on what we're meant to be talking about? We have a election coming soon. We can fight then. Let's just do this now.
No, but I just think it's important to make sure we're factually correct in things that we put out in public.
And we thank you for that now.
I mean, I think it's been a really interesting conversation so far, and I know there's been a lot of people sort of wanting to. I think it's good that we're having sort of a slightly more fluid conversation, Chair, and allowing people to come in as and when, because I think, Seena, some of the analysis you had, I think, is correct, but I would probably put the reasons slightly differently in the sense that the culture around planning departments in councils, I agree with you. I think there is a kind of sense that things are a bit too slow. For me, I think it comes back to what Michaela was saying about a slightly more holistic solution rather than sort of like small tinkerings. So I think 10 to 12 years of austerity means that a lot of planning departments have been carved out of planning staff, so things do just take longer. But also I think there is that cautiousness around the rule book, and I think part of that is because there is, at the moment, I think we would have been, if we had moved towards a direction where we could give councils more weight around their local plans, that would have been better, because then they are a little bit more comfortable with the scene that they're setting, the rules that they're working around. What worries me is the planning reforms that have come through in the LURB, which would actually remove that sovereignty of the local plans under the NDMPs. So I think the analysis around planning is spot on. We are at a time when deep reform is needed, and I also find it odd to try and separate the two.
I know you're chair of planning, so please just talk about planning, because if I did that, you'd tell me off. So can we just focus on the question, because I do need to get through.
Chair, respectfully, if you keep interrupting me, I'm going to have to just
I will keep interrupting you. If you keep talking about planning, I will keep interrupting you, because as you well know, because you're chair of planning, this is a housing meeting. So please come to the question, and I will not interrupt you anymore.
The point I'm trying to make is if you want coherent solutions and you want a proper analysis of the problem, you are going to have to talk about planning. They are part of the same conversation. To try and separate them is to have a very siloed and shallow analysis.
The point I'm trying to make is we are here to hear from our guests, not from you.
And what have our guests talked about right now so far?
We are here to hear from our guests, not you. You've spoken an awful lot and not asked the question.
Chair, with all due
if our guests want us to talk about, fine.
Please.
I would really like it if you just ask the question.
It's an
that's
hour
on the
and 15
paper.
minutes into the meeting. It's the first time I'm speaking, so I don't think I've spoken a lot, actually.
I do, because I think you should be here to ask the questions to our guests. So just please ask the questions and we can get through the meeting. Thank you.
I'm asking questions to our guests who have talked about planning and have said that planning is part of the problem and therefore planning reform is part of the solution. So I think it's entirely appropriate to reflect that back to them and say I agree with it. And I think it's odd to see you try and censor conversations about
trying to censor any conversation. I'm the chair of this meeting. I'm asking you to talk about what is on the papers for this meeting. If you want to talk about planning, you have every ability to do so in your planning committee. So please ask the questions we have so that our guests can give us the benefit of their experience and knowledge.
Absolutely, Chair. And if our guests are going to talk about planning, I'm going to reflect that back to them. So anyway, as we were saying, I totally agree with you. I think that there is much wider wholesale reform that's required. And I think the planning reforms that have gone through the LURB right now don't sufficiently deal with it. And I would come back to what Michaela is saying, and I think that rather than having small-scale solutions, I think we need to take a big step back and say the whole system itself needs much more like rethinking in terms of looking at the lens through which we look at it. And I think that what you offered around potentially taking land out of the market, I think those are more of the solutions that we do need to bring to the table. So one of the questions I think that's probably been kind of like circulating is the impact of the housing crisis and the economic challenges on rents specifically, and what that means in terms of house prices and who gets to buy in London. So I was wondering, Michaela, and then I think I've got Katy down in the papers to come in on this, if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I don't think I need to tell anyone that rents are very high in London. You know, and like, so, you know, the point that I made before is that what that does is that hampers opportunities for young people, for all people, but let's say young people because they're starting out in their careers, in their lives, and they're making certain choices that will impact the rest of their careers. So, yeah, you know, Katy sort of mentioned at the beginning of this meeting that one of the reasons rents are high is because buy-to-let investors, who in this country tend to be, you know, individual people who maybe own, you know, a handful of properties in a not super professional manner. A lot of them have sort of done it as part of their pension plan, have decided to now divest from the market because it's not, you know, with the mortgage rates going up, it's not affordable. In London for a long time, yields have not been good, but people have been able to rely on capital growth, so the value of the property going up. I think even now in London, a lot of people can't rely on that, and even if they can, they're losing money monthly with the rates going up. So I think what we've seen is that those that can have sold their property, others have put the rent up to meet new mortgage payments that are higher. The other thing, I guess, to say about buy-to-let is that a lot of them will have interest-only mortgages. So I don't particularly know the maths on it, but so they would have seen a lot bigger increase than perhaps some of you are thinking if you've got a capital repayment mortgages on your own home. So they're really feeling the pinch of the interest rate rise. And I think it can't be understated that it went from 0.25% to 5.25%. Like, that is actually a huge amount in not a very in a very short amount of time. So yeah, so I say all that to say, so that's had obviously an impact on rents, which I personally think is quite detrimental to the society as a whole, because what that means is that, you know, people are saving less, and it's not always just about saving for a house deposit. You know, what we saw with COVID is that, you know, there could be things where people lose their jobs or are unable to work, and there, you know, the safety net that is there, which is universal credit or whatever, £50, £60 a week, I'm not sure. You know, if you're on a middle income, that's not the type of income that you'd be used to, you know, having to survive off. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but essentially I think high rents are bad. I think that housing benefit this is perhaps quite controversial, but I think that housing benefit in some way contributes quite a lot to London's high rent, or has at least in the past. So not including this huge increase in rent that we've currently seen, but I think let's say in the last like 15 years. So you know, a third of rents in London, or Katy will know the statistics, but you know, are people using housing benefit to pay for that, and you sort of think, well, if you took that, you know, what landlords are able to ask for has been unaffordable for quite a lot of time, but obviously that's being subsidised by housing benefits, so people have been able to say yes to those kind of rents, and now they're at the position where they can't. But you know, and that's not to rail on people who obviously are on low incomes and need that subsidy, but in my opinion, the solution should have been more social rent housing, and you know, taking those people out of market rent, and then having access to social rent, so that the market rent stays within something that's affordable for people who don't qualify for social rent.
Thank you. And Katy, before I bring you in, I mean, could you just elaborate? You've mentioned obviously this will impact young people in particular, Michaela, but do you think that how do you anticipate it changing and shaping the demographics of London going forward if we don't have an intervention in this?
Yeah, I mean, I say young people in particular, but I think quite recently there was a study about older people actually, so people going into their retirement who are in private rent, and sort of how insecure that is for them. So one thing about the state pension, if that was all you relied on, it assumes that you've paid off your housing cost. So it, you know, so the lowest rate I think is like £10,000 a year, because it assumes that it's just your living costs. You don't have a mortgage and you wouldn't pay rent. So obviously, sorry, I don't mean obviously, but now we are seeing people who have not, you know, who are in private rent, and they've always been, or perhaps for whatever reason they've had to move into private rent, trying to meet housing costs that are, you know, extremely high, and that's very difficult for them. I think. How I see it affecting like demographics in society, like I said, you'll have increasing inequality. So you'll have people who can afford, you know, young people who can afford to rent in London and live their life normally. You know, people even with working from home, people still for lots of reasons need to be in London or fairly near to London. So you know, young people who move to London for opportunities, you know, they're going to find their self in house shares and things like that. And again, I'm not saying any of this is bad, and I think that private rent meets a lifestyle need for a lot of people that need to be flexible, but I think it should be a choice. I think if it's something that you're being forced into, we need to look more closely at that. You know, and I do think, and it's probably not popular to say this, but you know, that in terms of our demographics going forward, you see a lot of countries where, you know, the birth rate is falling quite a lot, and you know, when you sort of question that, it's people who, you know, obviously there's a lot of it is choice, and that's absolutely fine. But people who are having to put off either starting families at all, or for a lot later because of sort of the housing thing. And I think we've seen that in London, and I'm straying to a different point, but the primary schools closing. So a lot of primary schools are closing in London boroughs because there aren't enough children to sustain them. And I think that makes for a far less richer London if we don't have that full diverse spectrum of people. So we don't have young people, we don't have families, we don't have people on lower incomes, you know, and it just becomes, you know, only for wealthy people, you know, who can live there. Personally, I think that makes a worse London for everyone.
Yeah, thank you. You lose a thing that gives London its essence, its vibrancy, its diversity. Thank you. Katy, did you want to come in on any analysis around, the impact of the economic crisis and challenges on rent levels and home ownership? Thank you.
I mean, that was a really great and detailed overview, and I don't disagree with any of that. So I think, you know, the rental, sort of the challenge for renters at the moment is extraordinary, and we are seeing, you know, we are seeing it affect how people live. You know, people are living with their parents for longer, they are sharing for longer due to affordability, but also due to availability of rental stock. But the one thing I would say is that this is an issue. There's just going back to sort of the market, the pricing around the rental market. So during the pandemic, London's rents fell by about 10%, but following the pandemic, we saw really, really strong rental growth, and that's fueled by tenants returning back to the city. But it was also coupled with a fall in rental stock for the reasons that we've already covered around some of the landlords that are leaving the market, and that mismatch between supply and demand has really been the thing that's been driving strong rental growth through till now. We're still seeing strong growth. However, that rate of growth has started to slow. So rents aren't falling, but the rate of them growing is slowing. So I think it's now the region with the third weakest growth across the UK. So it has definitely taken a bit of a shift, having seen that stronger growth. And that suggests to us that renters are hitting an affordability ceiling. So it's not just about, thinking about home ownership is out of reach. It's just simply that the average, person renting will not be able to afford what rents are. It's come up against the ceiling, how much they can afford to spend on their rents. The latest stats, we use Zoopla for rent as a rental index. The latest stats as at October were showing annual rental growth for London is 9%, and that's the first time it's been below 10% since December 2021. So there has been a significant, changing position in the last couple of months where we've seen a bit of a shift.
Sorry, was that a breath for a pause, or were you going to continue?
No, that's, yeah.
Great. I saw Chris indicate, and Seena and Amy, if you wanted to come in on this at all as well, please do.
Yeah, I'll just make a couple of quick points. There's a great new paper out, and not by me, by a few people at the Institute of Fiscal Studies, where they basically estimate the effect of housing benefit and rents, and it's actually not that significant. It does vary. I can't remember the exact details, but I think the argument essentially is because it's a relatively small pool of the population, and they don't all spend their income on kind of the same housing stock. It doesn't actually have that much of an inflationary effect, but I'm happy to share it with the with the team. Then in terms of the drivers of rents, I think falling stocks kind of does now seem to be an indicator, but a key factor is rising income as well. I mean, that's a key. There's that when you have rising income, that drives up rents because people spend more income on housing. So you can't understand rising rents without understanding kind of the income growth as well, and also the mortgage market as well. There's good empirical evidence that when you increase more interest rates, this is global, you force people into the rental sector, and therefore, or they have to stay there, and therefore you gain that leads to a depreciating kind of house prices, but increasing rental values because they're in the short term.
Chris, did I understand correctly? Did you say due to increase in salaries, there's been an increase in rent?
Yeah.
But have wages not stagnated over the last few years?
No, not in the last couple of years. No, that's part of what's driven inflation.
But less than inflation.
Yeah, but even if they increase less than inflation, they still increase, and so rents still increase.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Seena or Amy? Amy, you wanted to come in?
I was just going to add, so I think there's been a lot of talk around the withdrawal from sort of the mum and dad landlords from the sector and the impact that's had. But I think that just reinforces the need for the professionalisation of the sort of rental sector and the real need to encourage the professional build-to-rent operators and investors who've got those long-term, holding abilities to come into the markets and making the opportunities, making it an arena where they want to invest, not just in other parts of the country, but in London as well. So supporting that investment.
Thank you. I think I can hear here's around the table. I think we're all keen to see a professionalisation of the rental market, and I think that's a really helpful comment. Seena, if you don't have anything to add to this, I'll move on to the next question. Fantastic. Katy, I think I'm coming back to you around the structure of the house building market in London. If I understand correctly, I think, Chris, some of your research highlights that the house building market is primarily dominated by 3 large firms. So what impact has this had on the sector and the financial viability? And I think some of this has been spoken about so far this morning, so please feel free to draw on it. But how has that changed over the years in London, and what's the impact been?
So I don't have the stats by house builder, but what I have got is some stats around the starts on site. So I've banded the developers who are delivering sites of less than 50 homes. And those of less than 10 homes. So there's a slight caution on the less than 10 homes one because I'm using Molior data and it only really looks at small sites, less than 10 homes on the inner London boroughs. But even so, it's consistent in its methodology. So to compare the two periods should still be a useful benchmark. So starts on site, I've looked at the period which I'm calling the pre-pandemic average. So that period between the average between 2017 and 2019, and I've compared it to the year to date this year, 2023. So for small sites of less than 10 homes, the number of sites has it used to account in the pre-pandemic average of 11% of all sites starting, and it's now currently 1%. So there's been a big shift in the number of homes that are delivering fewer than 10 homes. If we change that banding, I hope I've still got everyone with me here. If I change the banding to looking at sites, let's call a small site or an SME sort of site of less than 50 homes, there's still been a shift. It's not as dramatic. So it's changed from being 51% of all of the starts on site down to 43%. But even so, even sites on less than 50 homes, even this year, with showing that they account for 43% of all starts on site, which I thought was still quite a high number, but that still only equates to just 6% of all of the homes started, because they're essentially just delivering smaller sites. So when you're thinking about what are the solutions for thinking about solving London's housing crisis, small delivery, the SMEs are delivering. Even in the pre-pandemic average, they're still accounting for a very small number of homes. But I know it's an input. It's obviously been part of the Mayor's policy to try and boost this. But that's, for me, not the needle moving solution. The big issue for me at the moment, the glaring issue, is how to get the house builders back interested in London, the big players, because at the moment, even Barclay, Barratt, they're not buying land in London. And Amy very rightly picked out the very important point, is that anyone operating in London at the moment, any of the starts on site, it's been the RPs who are already committed. If they've committed to their residents on an estate regeneration, they're going to continue to plough on through, because it's the right thing to do, and they will find the money to do it. That pot is not endless, though. That's good intentions. They're looking at different ways, doing joint partnerships, any other way that they can try and get those estate regens going. That's been a significant part of the delivery that's been happening in this very uncertain market.
Okay, Katy, thank you. That was really helpful. Chris, I don't know if you want to come in, because I did quote your research around this in terms of there being 3 large firms that dominate the house building market in London, and just the impact that has on financial viability and the sector more broadly.
So that research was for England as a whole. So those big three deliver about typically between 25 to 30% of all stock in England. It's much smaller in London. I don't have the numbers, but yeah, as Katy said, it's a different ecosystem in London, as we discussed earlier. Yeah, the only thing I would the other thing that I could mention, it's a question. I suppose it's a question, because I'm not sure. Is, I mean, there should come a point where the land market adjusts, and where you get land markets essentially being priced to account for higher interest rates, to account for the second staircases. Again, we don't know how long I don't know how long that'll take, and it might make some sites unviable. But in London, it should, given land values are very, very high, I imagine a lot of sites would remain viable. So I mean, that's I suppose a speculation that I would, from an economic standpoint, I would expect land prices to be eventually to market to clear, and for the prices to come down to reflect it, which should therefore make development that's not now viable. But there's always that's a speculation, but I thought it was worth making.
Thank you. Seena, you've indicated.
Yeah, I just wanted to flag that in England and in London, we've got a very uniquely feudal house building system where the delivery of house building rests in the hands of just a few. When you look at other countries, this isn't the case. When you look at other parts of the UK, actually, this isn't the case. And whilst, yes, we won't move the needle significantly by having more SME house builders, diversity in who builds houses is essential to create a resilient house building system. And we absolutely need to get more SME builders into house building. That's essential for the long-term future of house building.
No, I agree with that point. I think that's well made. I'll just move on to my final question. Chris, you sort of have begun already answering this, but I will ask it nonetheless, which is, your research has stated that the UK's biggest house builders tend to focus on, and I quote, profits over volume. Does this reflect what is happening in London as house building experiences an economic downturn?
I mean, I'm not sure. So what we see in the England and Britain, not including Northern Ireland, it's different. There is since the global financial crisis amongst the big volume house builders, there has been a shift to from increasing volumes, which was what they were prioritised before the global financial crisis, to basically prioritising margins, that is profit margins. And what that means is they essentially they build less supply, and they focus much more on trying to maximise the margins of the supply they do build, through, for example, building out at a slower rate, or etc. So that's but the extent to which that is true true in London, I honestly couldn't make. I don't know whether our research didn't differentiate between London and the SESK, so I can't. Yeah,
no, that's fine. Just before I hand back over to the chair, Katy, I just want to pick up on one final point that you made around. I think you sort of, for instance, quoted Berkeley and Barrett, if I remember correctly. It was your comment just in terms of the biggest house builders. How, and please feel free to draw on comments I might have missed earlier this morning, but how can we get UK's biggest house buildings investing their profits back into new developers? How can we re-entice them to feel confident again in London?
I mean, I'm not sure I've got an answer that's within the mayor's power. Having a stronger, if you were to find a way to either find more land, think about demand and supply. You can either find more land that provides the right opportunity, investment in infrastructure which makes some of those opportunities seem more viable, and also opens up to wider demand, or you address the demand side, which obviously Help to Buy was a massive help. It really opened up demand, specifically drawing demand to new homes. So that's been the real adjustment. There are still first-time buyers actively buying in London and have been over the last year. Yes, the volumes have been down, but it's not that nobody is able to buy. They just haven't been choosing new build. So what will it take for those buyers to choose new build? That's the bigger question. I would like to say that it's a moment in time. Hopefully the big house builders have their ducks in a row. They have very large internal planning teams that are going through replanning, redesigning to account for the new regulation which they will want to adhere to. Hopefully it's a moment in time around interest rates by the middle of next year. Certainly we use Oxford Economics forecasts, and by Q2 of next year, that's when they expect that we'll start that gradual decline in terms of the base rate. So again, a bit more certainty on that and wider confidence in the market. I mean, other than that, I think it's addressing some of the policy points around affordable housing, SIL, anything else that would give them, a stronger case initially to make that scheme more viable.
Okay, that's really helpful, Katy. Thank you. If no one else wants to comment on this, I'll pass back to the chair. That looks like everyone's...
Sorry, there is one other point that actually hasn't been raised yet, and it's something that our viability team mentioned. Actually, Amy kind of touched on it, but there's no market for Section 106s at the moment. There is no market. We have whole teams within Savills who are actively set up to, sell on these packages to the market, and none of the RPs are interested, that because of the rules around it not counting towards their targets for the Affordable Homes programme, and that appears to be a big sticking point for, clearly the developers will be thinking about this, because that's part of their viability is getting in that cash for the Section 106 as well. So if that's being affected, as well as everything else. They have limited. It's affecting the demand for their product. Slightly different way of thinking about it because it's an affordable chunk, but it's affecting the viability.
Sorry, can you just clarify that point a little bit more when you say there's no market for the Section 106, Katy? And sorry, is there any effect from the kind of LURB planning reforms coming in around the infrastructure levy? Do you anticipate any of that?
I'm not too sure because so one of the things that our viability team are mentioning a lot at the moment is that they're really struggling to sell it. They've had very minimal interest. They've had no bids on Section 106 packages, and it's been a real change. And the feedback that they're getting from the register providers is that they can't look to buy those sorts of products at the moment, especially when it won't count towards their targets for the Affordable Homes Programme. Okay, and I believe that's maybe a recent change for this for the new programme.
No, that's helpful actually, because that's just come onto my radar. Katy, you've got your hand up, I think, on this specific point. Thank you for that, Katy. Amy, sorry, that's what I meant.
Yeah, I was just going to add to what Katy's saying. It's not just the fact that they don't count towards the affordable programme in terms of the grant. It's a management issue for the bigger RPs. They don't want to acquire 6 units on a particular site because in terms of managing those homes, it's intensive in terms of the number of homes that are there. So their preference is for larger amounts of affordable homes in one locality so that they can streamline the management of those. So it goes back to, I think, a point I made a little earlier. I think we need to think more flexibly, more innovatively about how we get the numbers of affordable homes, because there's no denying we need those, but actually, is there a better way to generate that supply, whether it's through acquisition powers in terms of land, whether it's through charging some kind of levy that's then applied. I don't know, have a magic solution, but I don't think having 2 affordable homes on a 10-unit scheme or something, 2 here, 2 there is just not working. As Katy says, they're just not getting away to the RP sector.
Okay, thank you. I'll pass back over to the chair now.
Assembly Member Cooper. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I want to talk about increasing output amongst house builders. And I'm going to start with Chris and then I'll come back to Katy. Chris, how have house builders responded to government interventions intended to boost house building in recent years, and obviously with specific reference to London?
Which government interventions?
Okay, well, is that your answer? You don't feel that there have been any to boost?
No. I'm just wondering which. If you could be more precise, so I could answer the question. Yeah.
Any interventions at all?
So help to buy?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you see help to buy as an intervention to boost house building.
Yeah. Oh, I suppose if we take the example of help to buy, then if we take the big 3, then their response was to increase their volumes slightly, pretty much broadly in line with what they were doing anyway. They didn't dramatically ramp up supply. What they did do was they basically, I'm talking about the big 3 specifically here. They basically wound down their own shared equity schemes. So before they had essentially their own help to buy, where basically they provided some of the equity. Now that the government provided their own equity, they basically stopped those schemes and let the government take the risk for them, as they naturally would do. But they didn't dramatically, and obviously it helped inflate their sales prices as well. So that's how they. I would say that's how they responded specifically to those big 3 responded to help to buy in particular, which I guess would make me, I'd say help to buy did probably increase supply, but it comes with you need to kind of two really important caveats. One is it inflates new build premiums, inflates the price that you pay for new build houses over and above the the existing stock, and it does that particularly in London because. And there's a very, very good new paper published in kind of Journal of Urban Economics by a colleague of mine, and which shows that that increase in new build premium as a result of Help to Buy is particularly large, because the supply response is very, very is the weakest. So in other parts of the country, such as slightly lower land values, and Help to Buy leads to a
slightly lower land values, maybe some greenfield sites as well.
Yeah, exactly. Leads to a larger increase in supply, and also planning system is a factor as well. We can't do that. So, but in London, it leads to much weaker supply, and therefore you get a much stronger feed through into prices. Which ultimately it's the first time buyers who buy these properties who when they go on to resell that property are going to have to bear that cost. And the other thing with Help to Buy is it potentially it's in a competitive land market, it's going to inflate land values. So it's going to benefit the landowner because you see an increase in sales prices, and then that's going to feed through into an increase in land prices. As I say, outside of London, the land market wasn't competitive. Sorry.
No, I was going to say, sure. I mean, and indeed, some people did say that Help to Buy might inflate prices and land values when it was being introduced by the government. So, I mean, who knew that this could possibly be the result of introducing that policy? I'm just going to come over to Katy, though. Do you think that's been the main government initiative? Do you think any of the other government initiatives have encouraged an increase in house building, and what do you think the impact of Help to Buy has been? Do you think it's just been on prices and land values, as Chris was setting out, that's been the main impact?
Yeah, I think that just starting with Help to Buy, I think it has been the main impact, and I wouldn't disagree that it has. It's added to that strength of market that we've seen over the last 10 years. And obviously since the scheme became even more favourable when it was increased up to 40%, that's when you really saw it take off in London. It was such a good deal compared to, it was a good deal across the rest of the country, relatively speaking to incomes and so on. But in London, it was a good deal, and it gave the house builders the certainty of sales rate. So it wasn't just that, I'm not sure they were necessarily factoring in how much like the new build premium would have been affected. But I think it's that certainty of sales rate that also affects the viability. It gives them that, that regular exit route to the point where they weren't needing at that point to consider build to rent and other sort of alternatives in the same way that they are now on large sort of regen schemes and so on.
So in one sense, it sort of allowed developers to keep the production line going, as one might say. So so it allowed it to continue. So if you were the government, or if you were the Mayor of London, and I'll start with you, Katy, as we were just asking, I was just speaking to you, what needs to be done to increase output amongst private house builders in London now? You can throw Help to Buy back in if you think that would help, or are there other measures that might be more effective or as effective?
If you think about, one of the other interventions that the government's done over the last few years, Homes England has had a really strong increasing involvement in the land market and with sort of various grants and so on. And you have seen the impact of some of that come through to London, where, it's only been because of significant grants with Homes England that some of the regeneration schemes, and indeed what the GLA's own involvement around sort of specific grant or involvement to get large complex sites off the ground, even Brent Cross Town, Homes England grant, Silvertown Quays, GLA involvement, big sites that have been helped through specific, whether it's infrastructure grant or other help. So I do wonder whether thinking about things in a slightly different way around developer contributions, maybe around infrastructure, so the SIL, or even going back to land and increasing land supply. If we're increasing, once we get the developers to a point where they are comfortable buying land again, if there's more land, we'll start to see more delivery come through. And I think having a bit more clarity on policy around green belt, certainly in some areas where it is well connected already, or if there's the capacity to boost that, could be good. And I know, you know, it is one of the misnomers really that there's no development that goes on the green belt. Of, you know, there is in some good cases, and I think again having a bit more clarity on the situation might be helpful.
So I can see that Amy wants to come in on this as well, but just before I bring her in, maybe this is the moment for me to pick back up with you when we were talking about the stalled sites, how many units we think might possibly be successfully built on them should these measures like infrastructure grant, or just grant anyway to help to build. What sort of figure do you think it might be? 9,300
homes, total homes, so affordable and private.
Okay, that's not going to solve London's housing crisis, but
no.
Thank you for that.
And I would suggest that that's a short term. I mean, I don't want to say it's not an issue, but there's definitely a moment in time where the smaller contractors are feeling the pinch. You know, there are also other contractors. So even for the sites that I know that Savills are working on, for the sites that did have Henry construction on them, they went bust. They're very quickly reacting and trying to fill that gap because the developers don't want to, you know, that it's in everybody's interest to keep this going. Some of them are half sold, some of them are almost at completion, you know, purchasers waiting to move in. So, you know, that it's hopefully a short-term blip on some of those sites, but there are some longer-term large sites that you can't quite understand, even the detail that we have through our own experience at Savills, and also the Molior database, which does give comments on each site where they interview either the landowner or the developer. It's sometimes quite hard to work out what is the issue here, because it doesn't always mention a second stair core. Sometimes it's funding, sometimes it, you know, it's just that what they're proposing, maybe they've come into some difficulties around the land or the type of building that they're proposing, and there's some unknowns. Okay. Not always explainable.
Okay, but thanks for filling in that detail. I will come to you now, Amy. It's your turn to wave the magic wand and tell me and the rest of the committee, you know, what needs to be done to really increase output amongst private house builders in London. Wave away.
I wish I had a magic wand. Wouldn't that be amazing? Just before I come to that,
but unfortunately it's at home.
Before we come to that question, I just wanted to pick up on the Help to Buy point and the significance of that. I don't disagree with what was said, but I was speaking earlier this week to one of the G15 RPs who said actually the removal or end of Help to Buy has increased their shared ownership sales, and actually they were struggling to get the shared ownership sales away when Help to Buy was live because of the competition. So I don't necessarily think just bringing back Help to Buy will in itself, you know, increase the sales uplift and suddenly be a magic saviour. So I just wanted to mention that. In terms of increasing
sorry, if I can just say, that's actually very interesting, because I think that was in fact what Chris was saying, was that people had sort of flipped over as house builders, so they were moving away from the shared equity development into the Help to Buy. So if the Help to Buy is now sort of stopped, then it looks as though at least the registered providers are going back towards the shared equity. But if you continue, sorry, we might pick up.
I mean, that's certainly the feedback I was getting from a couple of the G15 RPs. In terms of increasing output, I think, and it touches on some of the things that have been said, but I think there's huge opportunity to be more innovative in terms of how subsidy comes in. So we've talked about grant, but, you know, equity participation and, you know, the opportunity for partnerships. In my view, it's not realistic to expect any one sector or section of the housing market in its widest sense to solve this on its own. So I think we need more collaboration between the house builders and the GLA. And, you know, we've touched upon it and I've mentioned it, there's huge appetite from the institutional investors in investing in the housing sector, particularly in the affordable housing sector. But if we can harness all that together, I think that's where there's real opportunity.
Okay, so that's not even so much about grant there. You're talking about bringing in money from institutional investors more successfully than has been achieved to date?
Yes, I think there's two elements to it. I think there's bringing in the institutional investment, into a partnership or into some kind of SPV vehicle, or where they can participate. Potentially, they can also be as loan finance. But I think it's about that equity participation, because they're prepared to. If it's a rental product, they're prepared to hold it for a long term to service their pension or other fund requirements. But it's also then, in terms of the government and the GLA role, it's not just about the grant funding. It's about some of the things that have been talked about, is about making an investment, and perhaps you get your returns over a longer period. It's about perhaps they can come from the sales receipts if it's a sale product, rather than just looking at pure grant, and sort of bringing together all those sectors and seeing how much more can be done when people work together.
Thank you. I'm just going to see if Seena or Michaela want to come in on the opportunity to wave the magic wand and what would increase activity by private house builders, or indeed otherwise, I suppose.
I mean, it's about bringing down interest rates, because we know that will increase demand. More people will be able to purchase properties once we do that. So anything that we do that's going to help interest rates to reduce, I think, is probably the key here, and inflation as well, both of those things.
Okay, so you're looking more on the demand side rather than what can be done to help people sort of get more involved on the supply side.
Well, the challenge is that SME builders will build when there is a demand. They're not building speculatively. So we need to increase demand in order to increase the amount of house building SME builders do.
Okay. Did you want to come in, Michaela, as well? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I had the same point, and I think the interest rates is also about supply, because the builders are also borrowing, and they also need to borrow at now higher interest rates, which obviously has a knock-on effect. And I'd imagine a lot of the sites have stalled because of that exact reason, that the debt has become too expensive for them to carry on with those sites. So I think looking at if it's a strategic site, like a practical way. So outside of London, I take the example of Brighton. One of my clients in Brighton, the council have borrowed the money because they had access to Public Works Loan Board lending at a lower interest rate, so they were able to borrow the money on behalf of the client to get a certain site finished. It was a smaller site than probably what we're looking at here in London, but I know also in Harrow, I looked at one many years ago, which was a civic centre redevelopment, and that was also looking at the council borrowing at the rate they could borrow, and almost subsidising the developer with that. So I think things like that could maybe be looked at. There is no magic wand to say, well, don't pay any interest rates. There is a risk to all projects, but whether it's instead of paying the interest rate that would be expected of a developer with a certain risk profile, for maybe the council to take on that risk in exchange for whether that's equity in the scheme, whether that's a certain amount of units, that kind of thing. So, yeah.
Okay, which brings us on nicely to the next area that we want to look at, and I'm going to start with with both of you really, and then possibly bring in Amy if she wants to come back in, and that's the kind of support that small builders and community-led housing might need. In 1988, SMEs were responsible for building 40% of new built homes, but by 2018 that has dropped to just 12%. The Mayor's housing strategy speaks very clearly about the home building industry needs to be diversified to increase capacity and speed up delivery, which we've touched on already during this discussion. So do you think boosting the capacity of small builders will speed up delivery, and what is the best way to do that?
Well, the simple answer is yes. The challenge and what we're seeing at the moment is that there is a reduction in the number of SME builders that are planning to remain in the house building market in London. And what we need to see is the opposite. So anything that can be done to support those builders to either stay in the market or to encourage others to enter the house building market would, for me, help to address that particular issue. And I just really want to emphasise that, taking it right back to after the World War, how did we rebuild London? We didn't do it with large developers, we did it with SME builders. We absolutely need to make sure that SME builders are properly supported to be able to build houses in London in order to get house building back on track here.
Okay, thank you. Michaela, I mean, you were just positing the idea that councils borrowing from the Public Works Loans Board at very preferential rates, lower rates, could help get things off the ground. Mm-hmm. Would you agree with Seena, and would you mention anything else that would help?
Yeah, so I think so. Seena's point earlier that most small builders, I think your figure was 84% are for self-build, and I think actually what we need to look at is empowering people to do more self-build. And I know that in this country, when we say self-build, we think grand designs and we think like a retired couple, gigantic house, not going to really meet the housing need. But in other countries, a lot of the housing supply comes from self-build, and that doesn't mean you're there after work with your tools and whatever. It just means that you have a plot and you get the builder to or contractors to come and do it. In other countries, it's a lot more sophisticated as well. So people do build apartment blocks via self-build, and I think we need to look at things like that here, because it is still expensive to build a house, and there's probably not a lot of ways to get around the fact that building one standalone house is expensive. If, however, you could build a small block of flats, and I'm talking 2 to 3 stories, so not a high rise, with a bunch of self-builders, so, whatever, 6 families, let's say, the cost and everything comes down sort of dramatically. And I have seen a case, I believe it was in Scotland, it may have been in Edinburgh, where, this happened in the UK, but it really isn't something that happens often.
So where does it happen? I'm not including Scotland as abroad.
Yeah.
Myself.
So I mean,
Holland?
So in Denmark, it's quite a popular model for families to sort of get together and get the plot, get together, build, like I say, something 4 to 6 flats, let's say. So, we're not talking about a giant development. And I don't think we ever really will be with self-build, because it would always be more efficient once you're getting into huge numbers to just go with a big builder. So I definitely think there needs to be more support. I think the mindset here is that we're waiting for the council to house us, waiting for builders to build our houses, or waiting for, and I think that actually people just need to be more empowered to say, well, actually, there's something you can do. There's, a lot of talk is about grant, but I always say, like, knowledge is so important. Like, if we can just get the knowledge out, that how does a group of people, understand how they can meet their own housing need. Like, if you're a couple of parents that meet at the school gate and you're all in the same situation looking for housing, like, actually, how do you get together as a group and meet your housing need, which is, what community-led housing is all about. And I think the problem we have with community-led housing, apart from the funding, is the shallowness of how how deep that knowledge goes, because you meet a lot of groups, and I personally do, that have never heard of community-led housing, and the people that I speak to are often the people who would most benefit from it, who have never sort of heard of it. I think that more education is needed to push self-build agenda, not in the grand design sense, but in the everyday need that then allows small builders to have this pipeline of clients, that they can work with.
And do you think spreading that awareness about what people have done in Denmark, or just about self-build generally, is something that the GLA could help with?
Definitely, yeah, definitely. I think it's something. I always say to people in the field, you need to be an evangelist. Like, your family should know what you do, and my family don't know what they do, and that's not for lack of trying. I do try and explain it to them. But because that. There will be people within your own family network who would benefit from, knowing about self-build, knowing about community-led housing, who are perhaps on the council housing waiting list, which is going to be a 10-year wait, or whatever. And so there are different routes that we should be telling people about. And definitely, I mean, the GLA would definitely be able to play a role in that.
So councils, the GLA, and just everybody, or
everybody. Yes, everybody.
Yeah. Seena, I'll come back to you then.
I just wanted to stress as well, I mean, I totally agree, and that would be fantastic, and I'm sure many of our builders would be really excited to build those kinds of properties. When you're building with self-build, not purchasing a property, it's not a mortgage. That's not the finance route. The finance route is something that has higher interest. It's developer finance. So anything that can be done in terms of whether that's borrowing via the GLA to reduce that interest rate would be really helpful as well.
Yeah. Okay. I did say that if Amy wanted to come in, I would bring her in as well. Or are you okay, Amy, for commenting on this? You're fine.
I'm okay, thanks.
Okay. Back to you then, Chair. I'm obviously not passing over to
Thank
Shah
you,
Berry.
Assembly Member Devonish.
Thank you very much, Chair. To Seena and Michaela, please. The Mayor's housing strategy states, and I quote, "We need to develop more small sites for housing, and these sites are likely to be less attractive to larger construction firms, which tend to focus on larger schemes," end quote. However, small sites can be more complex to develop, as we've already heard. To what extent are smaller house builders and community-led schemes able and equipped to deliver on these small sites? And could you remind me how many small sites have been developed by the GLA in the last 7 years, please?
I cannot remind you of that because I don't know that figure, but yeah, so I don't know if anybody else has that personally. So going back to my point that I made earlier, small sites are extremely tricky to work on for logistical reasons, but also because of it's hard to find builders that have the expertise to work on them. If I go back to the example that I had in Harrow, where it was three sites, so there were 2 clients, and between them they had 3 small sites, and in total that was 11 units across those 3 small sites. And essentially we had to try to find a builder, because they didn't want to do 2 units, they didn't want to do 3 units, so we had to try and find a small builder that would do all those, they would do all those sites. They were completely spread out. I don't know how well any of you know Harrow, but they were, Stanmore, Wildstone, forget the other one, more Harrow. So anyway, those are areas that, in terms of pound per square foot value, are extremely different. So essentially it was extremely challenging, and we weren't able to find anyone. And there's a lot of talk about modular, but the thing about modular is that there are not a lot of modular builders who will build an entire house from modular, number 1, but who have a track record, number 2. Developing is risky, and you can de-risk it by doing certain things like using someone who's already developed. So if you're looking at someone who hasn't developed on a already risky site, the chance of it going left are a lot higher. So I don't know, like I said, I don't have the figure in the last 7 years how much has been developed on small sites, but what I would say is that I think there was a lot of promise, and there was it sounded great because we do have clients that need like 2, 3, less than 10 houses. So technically a small site sounds like it would be great, but there is usually a reason that those small sites have not been developed up until this point. So a lot of the infill sites would have already been developed if they had, if they were easy to develop. So what you're left with is the harder ones. One of the things I mentioned outside this meeting, but was about, we still need those small sites, but they can be a small site within a larger scheme. So it's not saying, well, this can only accommodate 2 units, here you go. Like, if there is a site that can accommodate 100 units, 10 of them could perhaps go to a small, community-led housing group, or a small builder, or, self-build, or the whole site is split between a series of small builders. The estate I personally live in, which is just outside London, Hertfordshire, was post-war estate, and that's completely been built by, it's a huge estate, but each builder had their own section. So, the houses are from road to road completely different depending on which builder built them. And I don't see a reason why, again, going back to that post-war era, we can't look at that instead of looking at these giant sites and saying, right, we need a giant builder. Look at those sites and say, well, okay, how can we split this up to allow a series of small builders to develop this for us, using their expertise. So that would be my point on that.
Seena?
I totally agree with that, and I think the point made about Why are these small sites in existence still? Yes, because they're difficult to build on. And we spoke earlier about how smaller builders don't always have access to specialists. They are more generalists, and as soon as you start to involve specialists, it brings the costs right up. Having said that, one of the beauties, I suppose, of SME builders is their ability to be agile and adapt to small changes that are required in building in different areas. That is something that they do all the time. They're building different things all of the time, and it's not about a standard uniform way of building a home. One of the other things that I think is really important is some of the small sites are in locations where there are particular constraints around the style of building, and that can add additional cost. When you're talking about additional cost, that doesn't really lend itself well to affordable housing. So again, it makes the demand more difficult to secure for those sites.
I think I may have asked this already in a separate way, but I'll just ask if anybody else here maybe can answer this. What actions have you seen from the Mayor to help achieve this? Has any of this been successful in the last 7 years, please? I don't think any. Can you?
I mean, arguably, if we're seeing more small builders exit the market, you would say that that's not been successful. I couldn't say hands down that it is wholly because the policy has failed. There's been other market factors, interest rates, inflation, demand reduced. So I think there's just a combination of issues that has resulted in that not really being successful.
Thank you. And to Katy and then Seena and Michaela, please. The London plan sets out a target of 120,000 completions on small sites across London by 2029. How realistic are the London plan targets for house building on small sites, given the current challenges to small house builders? And do we know how many have been built so far? Katy?
Yeah, it's funny because I think that's quite an obvious question to ask to do the scene setting on this, but I really struggled with finding the answer to it. I struggled on a number of levels because the GLA also report on small sites as definition on as less than 10 units, but then in the London plan the policy is based on 1/4 of a hectare, so it's on the size of the plot, which in some areas could be a scheme of 150 units if you go, if it's a tower or something like that. So it's really hard to get to the bottom of it. So actually I don't have the answer, I think, is probably just the quick way of saying that.
Thank you for that, Katy. That's quite an observation. I'm glad you've picked that out for us. We'll go back and ask the GLA to look at that.
Because it's the two things we're talking about here is there's small sites and then the various definitions of a small site, but then there's also the issues affecting SMEs, which isn't necessarily always going to be just on small sites. It really comes down to the definition.
Would you have a definition? Is there something in mind that you would start to look at for a definition?
I mean, I always find from a numbers perspective, I find it's easier to analyse and certainly from a policy perspective, when you're looking at affordable thresholds, it's based on a number of units. So I would consider a small site less than 10 units, but also a site that an SME might be interested in, a site of 50 units or even 100 units.
So the point is we need to define what a small site is. I think that's the start point, and then we could go from but having those two different definitions, one on area and one on number of units, is probably not useful because you can't compare things properly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, we'll speak to the GLA about that. Sorry, Assemblyman Downish, do you have another question?
Do Michaela or Seena have anything to add on that?
Yes, just to reiterate the point I made much earlier on, if we're looking at trying to build that level of housing over the next few years up until 2029, and most SME builders are building less than 10 units, actually the majority between 1 to 5, and we're seeing people leaving the house building market and not more people joining it, I would argue that it's not realistic.
I think history would lend credence to your analysis there. But we'll go back again and speak to GLA about that, because I think that's important to marry the two things together, the state of SME builders and the state of this ambition. I think there needs to be some correlation there. Assembly Member Devonish?
I was going to ask my last question really in terms of the written ones, but I'm not sure. I think it's pretty much already been answered, Chair. The question is, are SMEs more likely to build homes that are less affordable because of the cost they incur in building? But I think we've already had the answer at least a couple of times. So I was going to ask one final question, which is, are the panel aware of the amount of land banking that goes on within the public sector? And do you think if you release some of the land, we always use the figure of TfL alone owned land 16 times the size of Hyde Park, would that help at all in unlocking house building?
Yes, but I would be very, very careful about how you unlock that land. So this is my own personal view again. I think that public land should stay in public ownership. So I think that land should be long leased to developers, because you can only sell land once, you know, but that can be resold at huge profit further down the line. And I think, anyway, side point, and I don't want to get into that. But yeah, so I think it would be great. Also, I mean, with the TfL sites, some of them are extremely tricky to develop. So I think it's a bit like the Greenbelt thing, isn't it? When people say, you know, there's loads of land, but then when you actually get down to the detail, it's the devil's in the detail, and actually a lot of it would be fairly tricky or just not extremely sustainable to develop. So yes, short answer is I think that it would help more land being released. But I don't think that we should do that in the same way that we've previously released land, which is that developers have pushed the price down quite a lot when it's been sold to them. They then waited for the market to do quite well, and then they've sold those units on for massive profit. And the public, and that's by that I mean taxpayers, don't necessarily see don't get the uplift from that. So that would be my personal opinion.
And maybe I'll finish with Katy. Have you done any research that would give any analysis to this, please?
Yeah, we actually have done a couple of pieces this year on public sector land availability. So the first is, you know, identifying it, but also acknowledging that a lot of it is operational and needed. So, you know, there definitely has been progress. You know, the GLA has been instrumental in helping the public sector try and coordinate themselves, marrying up the different sectors of the public sector. But there is a lot of land. There's a lot of land that isn't operational, that isn't, you know, that could be better utilised. So I would say the opportunity is still vast. I would say that the other angle that we have been looking at is trying to map up all of the public sector land, but also look at from Molly, or what are the other sites that are maybe privately owned that are adjacent, because then there's some sort of, you know, greater value to be had. And again, potentially going back to Amy's point, you know, a partnership that can help get things moving a bit quicker, as long as those sort of values are aligned in terms of understanding, and going back to Michaela's point, you know, to making sure that everyone feels like they're getting something from the site in order to hit the right boxes for them. I think there's definitely a lot more that could happen on public sector land.
Thank you.
And we've seen some really good examples so far, you know.
Thank you. And we're going to finish with Chris.
Yeah, just to point out the work of Brett Christopher has written a book basically about the privatisation of land in the UK, which is a really exhaustive analysis of kind of over the last 30, 40 years. The amount that has been released has been huge. And then this, not to say there's not still some remaining. And then the second point I would based on kind of following what Katy said, there's in London, I remember Mollyars had a report out a few years ago, basically saying quite a lot of private land is held by basically non-developing institutions, because of course land is a curious kind of asset, and that it doesn't appreciate in value. The location value of land depreciates. You know, if you buy land in London, if you buy land in kind of, I don't know, the north of England 100 years ago, you probably seen it depreciate. You might have seen it depreciate in real terms, but the actual kind of value of land itself. Unlike kind of machinery, which of course does depreciate, doesn't actually depreciate in value, which means that essentially if you own a piece of land, you own an option to develop, and you essentially want to, as a private developer, or a private landowner, you want to basically time that option to develop according to when you think it's going to be most beneficial to develop, which essentially means that which is essentially why landowners develop, because they essentially see why landowners hold land, because they essentially see an option to develop, and they have to time that according to when the market is best option. So I suppose it's just saying that just because land is privatised does not mean it's going to be developed. It could also be held quite rationally in economic terms.
Thank you, Chair. I'll leave it there and look forward to seeing the argument tomorrow at the plenary on housing.
As you can see, it's a hot topic and people are well prepared to argue about it. Thank you to all our guests. You've been an absolute education, and we'll take a lot of these things away. We'll write a report and present recommendations to the GLA. If you have anything that you think of once you've left, please don't hesitate to send a carrier pigeon, write an email, whichever is quicker for you, and we'll add that to our investigation. But again, thank you very much for your contribution today. We have some small formal items of business to complete. You are welcome to stay and listen to those bits of business, but of course you should probably get back to your busy lives. I'm sure you'd rather do that, but we'll continue. And again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oh, is there a hand? Is that a new hand, Katy, or old hand?
Just one final point from me. I was wondering whether it might come, the conversation might come back round again. But just thinking about, okay, so I've been asked a couple of times now, what would it take for the house builders to come back to London, and what would it indeed sort of, help everybody who's developing in London, whether it's SMEs or the larger ones? I think the first thing, I've talked a bit about land, but actually, I think the first thing that you need to think about now is demand. And obviously maybe it's not a case of just saying, look, we'll have another Help to Buy, that would be lovely, thank you. There are other things that could be that could help, and one of the things that I think is brilliant that someone else has suggested, the HBF have proposed that there's suggested a stamp duty exemption for EPC-B and above, which would pretty much be all new build, and I think that could be, that could give the sector a boost. I've mentioned already that there are first time buyers out there across the wider market. We just need to draw them back into new build. This could be a solution. I guess the question is whether whatever that saving would be on stamp duty, whether that would be enough to be a real incentive. But that could be one of the levers, not for the mayor, but a bit above him. But that could be quite a big impact on the market.
Katy, thank you for that, and we'll have a look at that as well, and possibly add it to our recommendations.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Can we note the report and today's discussion? Can we delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with party group leads to agree any output arising from this discussion? Agreed. Can we note our work programme for the 2023-24 Assembly year? Noted. The date of the next meeting of this committee is scheduled for the 16th of January 2024 at 10 a.m. in City Hall Chamber. I have no other urgent business. I declare this meeting closed.
This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast